We are in the midst of an update to the comprehensive plan, which is kind of the large umbrella project that this event is part of. Before I turn it over to the panel, just want to give you a quick 2-minute kind of summary of what we're doing with the comprehensive plan. In April 2017, we went to town meeting for an appropriation to update the comprehensive plan. It's been last updated in 2004, so the current plan is a bit out of date, and we've been lobbying internally to update that for some time. So we were really excited when town meeting gave us an appropriation last year to get this important document underway. A comprehensive plan, just for those who don't know, and this is the 30-second version, we could probably have a seminar just on what comprehensive plan is, but in essence it's the physical development plan for a community. Massachusetts state law requires that these plans touch on a number of elements. The big picture ones are housing, transportation, economic development, land use, and if we had more time we could go into all of that. So I'll put in a plug for our website if you want to go and learn more, lexingtonma.gov/comp plan. That'll bring you right to the current web page. We've got all the information that we've produced so far there. We've had a couple of CPAC meetings, that's the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee. They've had a couple of meetings, we've had a couple of panel events, those have all been taped. All of the links and all the information for those meetings are on that webpage, so you can get up to speed there. In general, the project is being done in 2 parts, and we're in phase 1. Phase 1 is kind of what I would call the due diligence or the prerequisite stage. So behind the scenes staff, we're working on a lot of the, what we're calling the trend reports, so a lot of the data that is going to feed the bulk of the plan is under development right now. We're reviewing old plans and old policy documents to see if we can define any trends from that to help feed into part 2 of the project, which is when we'll really be diving into Lexington-specific information, teasing out the vision, teasing out the goals, and how we're going to accomplish those goals. So in phase 1, as while we're doing the background information on the data and pulling the trends out, we thought we would do these panel discussions. This is the second of 6. We had one scheduled for last week, but Mother Nature intervened and decided it didn't want to go down. So we'll be rescheduling the housing panel, but we're having 6 panel discussions on 3 topics, so 2 panels for each topic. And we're focusing the panel discussions on housing, economic development, and transportation. Those seem to be kind of the red button issues. And the purpose of these panels is, again, to kind of set the stage for talking about Lexington in phase 2. So if you had any Lexington-specific questions, we have these cards on the table. If you can write that question down, we will deal with that. We'll follow up with you after the event. Today's event and all of these panel discussions is really about kind of understanding the context in which Lexington is operating in the greater Boston area and some of the forces that kind of bear down on the community as we go into the phase 2. So we really wanted to make sure we had a strong foundation of what's going on in the region. So today might not get down to what is the traffic light situation at Woburn and Mass Ave, but we want to hear those types of comments, so that's why we have the blue cards. Please let us know what you're thinking. I probably glossed over some details that I wish I'd shared, but I do want to thank everybody for coming out. I see a lot of elected and appointed officials. I won't put myself in that situation and try to name everybody, but I do thank you for all coming out. I will point out Mr. Canale, the chair of the planning board in particular. They have been really great and helpful, and as staff kind of tried to push this idea and have taken the lead in a lot of what we've been doing over the last 12 months with this project. So I want to put a plug out and thank you, Richard, and the planning board. With that, I will turn it over to Craig Seymour of RKG Associates, who will be leading this moderated panel. There'll be a little time for Q&A at the end, if I'm not mistaken. Again, if it's You can ask a Lexington-specific question. They will do their best to answer it, but hopefully your Lexington questions are kind of in context of the bigger region. If you have specific questions, please get them on the blue card. If you didn't sign up on your way in, if you can get that on your way out. And again, a plug for our website, lexingtonma.gov/comp-plan, one word. If you haven't already signed up for our email distribution list, please do that as well. I think we are over 200, and we've been blasting out all kinds of information to all kinds of lists, so hopefully you can just subscribe to the comp plan email list and reduce the clutter in your inbox. So with that, anything else? I'm looking at Mr. Fields. David Fields in the back, I should also point him out. He's really been the engine of this. He's been nice and let me stand up here and take the glory, but really all the work has been, Mr. Fields has been the engine for that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Steele.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. It's usually not a problem because I can usually talk pretty loud if I have to. Usually too much too, so I'll try not to do that. Today's panel, we're going to run for about an hour or so, maybe 45 minutes of directed questions. And if I could ask you to hold your questions to the end, and I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions for any of the panelists. We're also asking you to think in big terms, 30,000-foot terms, as opposed to what's happening over here in the local block, because this is the purpose of this is really to start to set a context for where Lexington is within the greater region, the greater Boston metropolitan region, and how that's going to reflect upon what's going to happen as you boil down the process into the comprehensive plan. My name is Craig Seymour. I'm President and Managing Principal of RKG Associates. We are a planning and real estate economics firm with offices in Boston and down in Washington, D.C. We've been at this for about 40 years, working with communities as well as with the private sector, and trying to understand and the interface and helping those communities help with the interface between the private investment and development process and the public entitlement process, where the comprehensive plan is the very beginning point for that, because that sets the context, sets the rules and the regulations for how private investors are going to come to a community. My partner, Eric Halverson, is here. He's been coordinating this effort and leading some of the other panels. He's in the back, so he's available too. You live in a very interesting community when it comes to economic development. Your location on 128 and Route 2 is very critical relative to the kind of growth that's gone on along in the Boston metro area. As a suburban community, you've seen a lot of growth that has come down from 128, from the Beltway. You've got high tech, you've got manufacturing, you've got biopharma now coming in, and a lot of electronic stuff that's been here over the years. But coming down Hartwell Avenue and Hayden Avenue, making these inroads into and through and around the community. You also have a downtown that's actually is very unique. In fact, there's an awful lot of communities that we work in throughout the Commonwealth to say, why can't we have a downtown that's like Lexington's? And so it's a good thing to have. You've been successful in that, but it's also something you've worked hard at and need to continue to work hard to maintain, because there are challenges coming down the road. For this morning's discussion, we put together a panel of some economic development experts who bring international, national, regional, and local knowledge, and who work on economic issues on a day-to-day basis. And I'd like to introduce each of them first, and then I'm going to ask some specific questions to them. Again, if you could hold your questions to the end, that would be helpful. To my right is Amanda Chisholm. She's Vice President of Real Estate Services at Massachusetts Development Finance Agency, otherwise known as MassDevelopment. She's been there since October of last year, and in her current role, she offers planning and economic development expertise to communities throughout the Commonwealth on a number of real estate services, and she works on a number of projects, a large number of projects. Prior to coming to MassDevelopment, she was Chief Economic Development Planner for the MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, where she oversaw that agency's economic development activity program and worked on a lot of regional economic development policies. So we're happy to have her here this morning. On her right is Chris Steele. Chris is President North America of the Investment Counseling Associates. His 25 years of experience in location consulting, site selection, and economic development has given him a unique perspective on how the concept of place impacts business and community success around, not only in the region, but around the world as well. And we're going to come back and dwell on that, because it's that sense of place that I see in my 40 years of economic development as being one of the most critical aspects, often overlooked when you start looking at the numbers and the analysis, the tax impacts and those kinds of things. Chris also frequently advises government agencies and public sector organizations on business attraction and economic development. He led the state of Maine's program for economic development for a number of years in business development incentive programs and developing effective measures to attract what they call inward investment, as well as places like the province of British Columbia and all of the agencies that stem away from that in terms of creating that sense of place as an attraction for new businesses. And finally, over on the far right is Chuck Tanowitz. He's director of N Squared Innovation District. He's responsible for leading the top economic development project in the Newton-Needham Regional Chamber. N Squared is an effort to establish the nation's first suburban innovation district on 500 acres that border the two communities. In addition to developing partnerships with key local, state, local, and professional organizations, Chuck has also built a brand for N Squared and established a marketing program that aims at building awareness and to generate leads for new development. And again, it's getting back to that sense of place. And also to work with municipal officials on the public side and making sure that they're lined up, their goals and objectives are lined up with those of those you're trying to attract. And prior to joining N Squared, Chuck was vice president of Eric Moore and Associates, a nationally recognized branding agency where he worked with innovation-driven companies in diverse industries such as cloud computing, clean tech, building automation, educational technology, and big data. Thanks, Chuck. What I'd like to do right now is start off and give each of the panelists a couple of minutes just to talk briefly about what they do on a day-to-day basis and their involvement in economic development in Massachusetts. So Amanda, could you lead that off?
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. So as Chuck said, I'm Amanda Chisholm. I'm from MassDevelopment. Sorry, I should go to Chuck. My name's Craig. Sorry
We have
about
3 seats up here. It's okay.
Vice President of Real Estate Services. So I don't know if you guys are all familiar with what MassDevelopment does. We are the economic and finance arm of the Commonwealth. So we do provide a lot of financial assistance. We do everything from loans to bonds. We have some grant programs as well, focused on really commercial development, economic development, and facilitating that through the financial process. What I do actually work on the real estate side, so we have real estate initiatives at the agency as well. We actually run, I don't know if some of you are familiar with Devon's, it's a former military base. That's something that MassDevelopment's deeply engaged in. It's been a long project over many years, and it's actually now a model for military base redevelopment, so that's an interesting aspect of the work that we do. We also run what's called the Transformative Development Initiative, which is an initiative focused on gateway cities specifically, really trying to provide some enhanced economic development services in those cities. And we do some investment there as well, so have actually purchased or leased buildings and are working specifically on trying to redevelop and reinvigorate specific neighborhoods within the gateway cities. What I do is actually a little more broad. I run our real estate technical assistance program. That's technical assistance that's offered to any of the communities throughout the state. So it's not just gateway cities focused, which I know a lot of people think that we are, but we do offer statewide assistance. We recently had a call for proposals, so as Craig said, I have a ton of projects that I'm working on now. In terms of the scope of these projects, they can range from sort of district master plans that are much wider, or really site-specific feasibility, market work. We do a lot of our work alongside consultants, and the site-specific work that we do is focused on public properties, so we can't step in and help out with a privately owned property with our real estate technical assistance. That would be something we want to do through the financial side of the agency. So I'm project managing that. I also work on some policy initiatives. I'm trying to sort of coordinate across the state the technical assistance that's offered, because there is a lot in a lot of different agencies, so we're just trying to kind of streamline that. So that's just a brief overview.
Thanks, Amanda. Chris?
Sure. Thanks, Craig. So I'm Chris Steele, and I run here in North America Investment Consulting Associates. We're a firm of about a dozen people around the globe, at least most of us being Ernst & Young escapees. For the past 25 years or so, a little louder? Okay. For the past 25 years or so, I've been doing what's broadly called site selection. So working with companies as they're trying to figure out where in the world to locate their next manufacturing plant or back office, or even if they're looking to reestablish where the headquarters could be. So, we don't talk too much about our clients, but just from a list of the Bs, the Boeing headquarters move, when they moved from Seattle to Chicago, that was a project I was involved in. I've done several projects for Biogen, as well as for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, just to give you some of the breadth of the kinds of things that we do. Within Massachusetts, I'm also a board member of MassEcon, which is the state's public-private partnership for trying to go out and promote the Commonwealth as a whole towards businesses that are trying to invest or somewhere, and we're trying to make sure that Massachusetts is on their radar screen. One of the things we'll probably talk about a little bit later on when we talk about things that municipalities can do. MassEcon keeps a list called the Ready Mass 100 list of premier sites or buildings that are ready to go for companies that might want to come in. And I was just looking at the list here, not just Lexington, but a couple of the communities directly around Lexington do not have sites on that particular list. So we'll talk a little bit about investment readiness later on. In terms of the kinds of things that we're seeing around the globe right now, we're seeing a lot more activity in light manufacturing. Along this corridor, I know we're going to get into a lot more of a discussion. A lot of technology, a lot of innovation, and still a lot of health sciences, but it's changing in terms of its nature somewhat. And again, we'll get into that in a little bit more when we get into the details. Thanks.
Chuck.
I'm Chuck Kanowitz, and my job is to, in many ways, brand and motivate behavior. My background is branding and PR and marketing and that sort of world, so I came to this position thinking I was going to be branding an area, bringing it out, and attracting business in. And I've spent most of my day putting together a puzzle piece. I have a 1,000,000-piece puzzle in front of me, and right now I'm building the frame, and then I can work on the rest of it. And by that I mean Newton and Needham have a tremendous amount of resources that are great for driving innovation. We've got the people, we've got a number of the companies there, we've got the brains behind it. If you look at all the statistics, it'll tell you that the brains that run all the companies downtown in Boston actually live in Newton and Needham, many of them in Lexington. We all know this. How do we get them to build businesses in our areas? And that's the major challenge. What my area has is a couple of rather large office parks that were built sometime between 1950 and 1975, and they need to be moved forward into the 21st century. And that is a major challenge because you have not one entity owning any given piece of land. You have, in one case, we have, I think, 110 acres, and I think we counted 17 different owners to try to coordinate and push into one direction. These are huge challenges, and then on top of that, you have challenges of transportation, you have challenges of zoning, challenges of two different communities trying to operate this together. That's my day. That's my small problem. And then the larger problem is how do I bring companies in once I've established where we're all going. So it's a large, like I said, it's, all these pieces are in front of me, and how do we build this puzzle that actually can start to show what we do?
Thanks, Chuck. And I'm sorry you went with a brick wall, you can bang your head. It's show me how to do it really well. So. Let's start off. Amanda, I've got a question for you. The Massachusetts economy, at least the eastern Massachusetts economy in particular, is doing very well compared to other places around the country. What do you attribute that to?
So I think there's a number of different things we can talk about. I'm sure that you guys have had these conversations and heard some of this. I would start with our universities, our hospitals, alluding to some of what Chuck said, talent, which I think is not just in Needham, Newton, and Lexington, but also we have strong talent, obviously highly educated workforce, so a company that's considering Massachusetts knows that they can kind of depend on that piece of things. From the quality of life perspective, and alluding to what you talked about with the sense of place, we also have a lot of opportunities for recreation, for culture. So from the employee side of things, companies can feel assured that their employees will be able to enjoy those. Whether or not they're affordable is something that we can get into later and talk about. as well. But I think that that sort of research, universities drives a lot of our economy. We have that strong innovation system, particularly in Cambridge, but also along Route 128. And as we see that expand and grow, there's a lot of reasons for companies to stay. We can also talk about the flip side in terms of the challenges, but I do think that, you know, quality of life, our infrastructure, our research ability, the fact that we do have some public transportation, again, woes, but ability to grow around that transportation and some strong transit-oriented development opportunities as well. Some of the things that speak to
You
it.
know, Chris, from your, not only national, but really from a global perspective, how does Massachusetts, you know, are we doing well, and what's so attractive about it?
We are doing very well from a global perspective. You know, Boston, Greater Boston is one of those areas that definitely comes to mind in any sort of a conversation where the conversation turns to talent and to workforce. And it's one of the reasons that you start seeing things like the GE move to downtown, like PTC doubling down downtown and continuing to expand, like TripAdvisor and their expansions in Needham. We are one of the global centers for talent excellence, and it's funny because I've got a proposal that's going in later on today for South Carolina, where they are trying to develop a web portal to try and not attract companies, but attract talent. We don't have that problem. We have the problem where it comes a little bit later on, where they get here and they're trying to figure out what their housing costs are likely to be, as well as how they're going to trade off places where they can find an affordable housing situation, which is further out vis-a-vis the transportation that's going to take them to some of the advantages. Other things that are absolute advantages and why you keep having this region on the plate is on top of that workforce and the talent base that we're talking about, we have a lot of great companies here doing really, really interesting things, and they are excellent partners for other people that are trying to do excellent things. You want to be in the middle of that kind of an infrastructure, that kind of an innovation economy, so that you can keep moving ahead of what the rest of the world is doing. So it's kind of one of those places that glows bright red if you're looking for a place where you can come up with great ideas.
Great, thanks. And Chuck, reflecting on what Amanda touched upon, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges that our regional economy is facing over the next 10 to 20 years?
The number one challenge, you know, when you talk about there's talent and there's companies, number one challenge is transportation. You know, we talk about housing. Housing and transportation are inextricably linked. We do a great job of moving people east-west in Massachusetts. They can definitely get down into Boston and back out. This highway right here, or bike highway, takes a lot of people into Boston and back out. Where we have trouble is getting them north-south. And that's causing a tremendous amount of problems for 128. Chris's ride in this morning took him forever, and he didn't come from all that far. You know, my ride was a little better because I live close to Lexington, but you know, that problem of how do we move people around, and that's our challenge in the N-squared area, is we have a green line that runs right along our edge. It is actually the #1 light rail system in the country, runs right through our area. I can't get people from the green line to the office parks, and it's not that far away. If I can't get the people there, I can't get the talent there. I can't tap into talent from Somerville. I can't get somebody who lives in Grove Hall to Newton, and they're right next door to one another. I cannot get them there without an hour and a half on various buses and so on. This is a huge problem because there is housing that's affordable if you can get to it. There is talent. You need to link those people up, and until we can solve that, we're growing like crazy. It's great. We watch Boston take off, but the cities and towns outside of Boston are going to lose to Boston because of that. PTC just announced about it 6 months to a year ago. They're moving downtown from Needham for talent. They need it. It's there. They're in Needham. They've chosen not to go the other direction. TripAdvisor put its own transportation system in to get talent to them. These are problems that companies are dealing with. The 128 Business Council runs a number of shuttles right through here and so on. They take a long time. They're stuck on the highways, in the traffic with everybody else. We need to move those faster.
Supporting that, and in fact, you mentioned 128. 128 is probably the most famous beltway corridor in the world because of the amount of talent that's been created out here, the money that's been both invested and made on 128 and continues to be. But my wife's from Andover, and her father was in the construction business, and he had a road contractor that built sections of 128. And when they built it, they had a real huge argument on why anyone would build more than 2 lanes in any direction, because you're never going to need that much highway capacity. And now you look at it now, and it could be 10 lanes in either direction. It would still be full of traffic every day for 6 hours a day on it. So that's pretty amazing. Chris, I'm going to boil it down a little bit here to a site selection and competitive perspective. You mentioned that from a larger region, but how do those strengths, how do the state's strengths and some of the weaknesses perhaps, how does that work on a local municipal level? What can municipalities do to position themselves within that greater framework?
So you're actually, by asking the question from the standpoint of what can municipalities do, you're actually pointing towards one of the things that is to some degree a strength of Massachusetts and New England as a whole, and to another degree a weakness, or at least a liability. One of the great strengths that we have here is the ability to have local control, to be able to do things on a local level, and to be able to make things happen. The challenge is, on the one hand, you're dealing with a smaller pool of resources. We don't have coordinated regional efforts to try and do business attraction, business retention, coordinate transportation plans, coordinate housing plans, and things of that nature. The other challenge is if you are a company that's looking to come into New England, invariably at some point along the line, your consultant is going to say, well, yes, but you're going to have to do a town meeting. See, we're starting to get some of the laughs out of it.
Yeah.
So you understand and you recognize this. There is this concept of that hyper-local control on one point is an asset, but on the other, it means that all sorts of different debates come to the fore, where if you're a corporate, you're not used to seeing them. You're maybe used to, if you're a corporate coming into a community, being able to talk about the public transit system for a region, being able to talk about the zoning for what's going to happen for whatever. You may not be used to getting in there and having a conversation about a school board thing that's happening at the same time, or what's going to happen with the gas station that's down the street. Those are the kinds of conversations that happen here in New England. One of the best pieces of advice, one of the best things that I have seen communities do, regardless of their size, but particularly here, is to be able to know thyself. To be able to understand your own strengths and the kinds of companies that are likely to be looking at your community and that you want as part of your community, and to be able to anticipate what their needs are going to be, both in terms of identifying places in the municipality where they can go, making sure the regulatory framework is there, and being able to then coordinate with those institutions and groups that are out there that are speaking to companies of that kind, so that you understand the pressures. You can also be on the radar screen when they're starting to come through. Just on the regulatory side, just for one side of things, we've been talking about this Commonwealth being a fantastic location for biotech for years. And in particular, some of the suburbs being good for some of the production and some of the testing side of things. There's a problem. Most of the land use regulations for most of the municipalities in Massachusetts have height limits on structures. And if you're starting to do, for example, a biotech incubator and its cooling stacks, they all violate those height standards on all of the zoning and land use situations. So it's that concept of know the needs of the users that you're trying to attract, and then make sure that your regulatory environment anticipates those.
Great, thanks. That's a good point. And both the pros and the cons of town meeting. Again, boiling it down a little bit, I'm going to start with you, Amanda, then Chuck, I want you to pipe in on this too. The Massachusetts economy today, a big part of that is that the culture of small businesses and startup businesses who are increasingly seeking locations that are affordable, but they're also seeking an environment around them, kind of an urban, semi-urban environment that has amenities in terms of transportation and restaurants and yoga studios, whatever it might be. And Amanda, are there examples of communities that are really cultivating and supporting these kinds of spaces and attracting those small and mid-sized companies?
Yeah, so let me first, if I can, just quickly add to a little bit of what Chris was saying in terms of the sort of hyper-local piece of things. I just think it's really interesting for Lexington in particular, because you guys do participate in the Middlesex 3 Coalition, and that's been a really interesting model of communities coming together and trying to collectively market their strengths. That doesn't overcome the local regulation piece, but I do think that that's a really nice way to sort of get out in front of, private developers, investors, and present a more united front. So that's been a model that I've been really interested in and sort of following. So I'm sort of interested in how that's playing out. And then just to add, in terms of sort of getting sites ready, not only regulatory, but also from an infrastructure perspective, we have actually a new program, fairly new. It was authorized in the 2016 Economic Development Bill called the Site Readiness Program. And it's actually aimed at, if you know what sites you're looking to market, if you have a sense of what strengths you have in terms of what industries might potentially locate there, but you need a little more on the feasibility side, you need a master plan, maybe you want to do some light infrastructure. It's not a ton of money, it's not like MassWorks, but it can support some of those efforts. So just another resource that's out there to make people aware of. So now pivoting back, sorry to diverge there. I do think that that is really important. I think that employees are looking for urban amenities, employers as well. In terms of examples, New Bedford is actually one that comes to mind. They have what's called Groundwork, which is a incubator space in their downtown. You know, they've seen a resurgence lately, really focused on bringing back those urban amenities, providing those retail options, shopping, restaurants, so that people are right there in the center of that kind of activity, but they're also in a building where they have those opportunities to interact with other people that have great ideas. There's that startup culture, and that's something that we've heard a lot from communities, really interested in trying to facilitate that kind of environment. We also have a co-work program I was actually talking to Chuck about earlier to help support that and dig into sort of the feasibility of whether or not that's something that would work. It's interesting, particularly in the downtown setting, because not only is there that advantage of the co-work space, but you might actually be able to fill a building, if you have one, to help revitalize a downtown corridor as well. So there can be multiple benefits to exploring that, and I think more and more people don't want to be in an isolated office campus. They want to be, you know, in the midst of things in areas that are active and have those kinds of amenities.
That's a good point. I think a couple of other examples from small city size, downtown Quincy is one of them, and certainly Worcester is really starting to hit that point where it's starting to take off with the mix of not only the healthcare that's there, the innovative, you have a lot of colleges there, you see them starting to really attract a lot of young people in there. But it's important to get those amenities in there.
Right.
And Chuck, you're right in the middle of this. So.
Right. I mean, co-working is one of the I spend a lot of time studying and trying to understand what drives co-working into an area, because the co-working brings in a lot of people, and that will help drive some of those amenities. They're kind of like a chicken and egg problem, but if you can get the co-working going, the foot traffic will start to bring in some of those other pieces. Even keep in mind that even in places like Cambridge, where it is active, the building owners are curating their retail to try to attract other people and people into that location. So in some cases, I've spoken to coffee shop owners who said to me that they get spaces thrown at them, saying, please come in here, pay no rent, just show up in my building because I need you. So some of that is actually you need to really invite it in and want it there, which means you need to be working with the building owners to pull that off. Co-working is a very interesting use case because it's a very high traffic, high density use case, which causes other problems that run into zoning issues like parking and other kinds of pieces that exist within the hyperlocal infrastructure. And there's the issue of how much rent it is really driving for the property and what its purpose is. If you look at something like Mass Challenge in the Innovation and Design Building downtown in Boston, which is 1 million square foot, piece of infrastructure, it's an enormous building. They get that space for free, and I think they have 20,000 square feet or so. And they get that for free. They don't pay rent. They're there as a business attraction, as an economic development engine for the building, for the neighborhood. That's their job. The CIC started because the owner, the guy who had the property, didn't have anybody in it. And how do I fill this property? And the challenge I'm finding in the suburbs is that a lot of these properties are not large enough to sustain that use and still be profitable. So the municipalities in many cases step in and subsidize it to get it rolling. And the municipality needs to have the desire to do that, the desire to drive it forward. And the other challenge in co-working is actually in the personnel that run it. The key word that people miss in co-working is the CO doesn't mean cooperative, it means community. And you need to be able to build that internal community. The people who do that, it's actually a hospitality job. the person, that community organizer, that community co-person who does that, those are hard to find and hard to keep. And that's the key to making co-working actually work, is that individual. I was talking to some folks who were running a maker co-working space in Springfield, and the woman running it wanted to leave. She couldn't, because there was nobody to take the job. And she's like, I don't want to let this die, but I can't leave, because nobody's going to keep this alive. So that's one of the key challenges to make.
You know, Lexington has its own its informal co-working space. I got here really early because there was no traffic on 128, which was really amazing. But I was over at Panera, and there was four individuals with their laptop open, drinking their coffee and working away. That's co-working space in a way, because it's something where people, if you're working on your own, working from home perhaps, and you got to get away from it, those are the kinds of spaces that need to be cultured in order to build that. And it's also an attrition issue, because you may have this co-working space and only 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of those individuals who are starting a business are going to be successful. But that's all you need, is one of those to be successful, and to get them to stay in that community, move into their own space, and become a fixture in that. I was state director of a small business development organization for many years, and our success rate was how many people we could talk out of going to business who weren't prepared. And once in a while, those who were successful really became shining lights because they were successful in being able to get through that process.
What a lot of people say about co-working when they're in there is be able to work with the person next to you and understand something that you didn't understand how to do, and kind of get that rolling. There's a certain tipping point where companies go, I don't want to be here anymore, but they can't get work done. And finding that balance as well is key. But that's actually part of the community. What do you do with these people when they're done being in co-working? How do you move them out? How do you move them into the community? How do you not lose them to another community? And we're running into this right now in Newton. It's actually not an N-squared issue, it's a Newton issue. Co-working place just shut down. These building owners said, don't want to do it anymore, everybody out. How do we get them to stay in Newton? Do we want them to stay in Newton, or do we want to use them to leverage for something else? We have a little bit of disagreement about how to actually work with the people that want to move out. Some of them don't want to leave Newton, but don't have another co-working space to go to, so they're going to end up in offices that they're not ready to have. Is that a positive? I don't know.
Let's translate that into the physical aspects of the downtown. How do you make a community attractive to those, so they'll not only work there, but they'll also stay and be able to be a part of the fabric of the community? Is retail,
I don't know, that'd be a really good answer to that.
Retail plays a role in it? You have to have the right retail? You have to have...
The right retail mix plays a definite role in it. I mean, when I speak to the people in the N-squared area and ask them why they like working here, for a lot of them, especially where they are in life, it's, my daycare is out here and I can get my kid whenever I'm done. One guy actually is really into shoes, and there's a great shoemaker down the street, right? How do you plan for that? I don't know. But those kinds of, for me, it's about finding the cool places that nobody knows is there. One of the things that we have is this amazing Russian supermarket. It's kind of hidden back there. It's some great takeout food. I like having those little hidden gems that you find, and I think that really makes a neighborhood interesting. Then there's also the stuff that is there. You need a decent coffee bar, right? It can be Starbucks, it can be Panera, but you really, it could be even better than that. And you have that in spades here. I mean, there's 3 of them, in half a block. Those places people can sit and gather. There's this really interesting piece in real estate about these public-private spaces. Yes, it's a privately owned building, but the space is semi-public. Restaurants and cafes falling into that. The places to sit outside. The places people can have happy accidents where they bump into one another and gather. The bar scene is key for that. It doesn't mean you have to have a lot of bars, but having a few of them that people can kind of gather at the end of the day. Those are the key elements to it. And CVS solves this problem for everybody, but those drugstores and everything else that you need as part of your lives. These people's lives are around their work, not around their home. So that, especially when I find this with N-squared all the time, is people will say, my life is here, even though I live over here, but my life is around the office. So those, I'll do my food shopping before I go home, those kinds of things. But it's not thinking about the pieces that make life living around their houses. It's the people that piece that make life living around their office.
If I can just kind of add on to that a little bit, because it kind of comes to, as a site selector, we get asked by economic development organizations all the time, saying, well, you know, we've got a fabulous quality of life, and it's one of those things, yes, everybody has a fabulous quality of life, otherwise I assume you would not be living there. It's kind of a self-reflexive kind of a concept. The challenge, as I think Chuck is trying to get to, is that you're trying to anticipate the quality of life needs for the people that are going to be coming in. So it gets to the point that I think we were talking before about being able to try and anticipate what the needs are of the people that you're trying to attract, both from a workforce perspective and from a company perspective. The companies that Chuck's talking about are small, they're innovative, the workers tend to be a little bit younger. Their needs and their definition of quality of life may be somewhat different from a more established company that's bringing a couple of hundred people and maybe a little bit more advanced in terms of their careers. So being able to take a look at that equation in reverse and being able to anticipate the needs of those folks. One thing that kind of does feed into the downtown side of it though, we are starting to see, and actually this has been a trend over the past 5-10 years, it used to be that companies would try to, particularly in a suburban situation, address all of the needs of their employees within the four walls of their particular building or their particular campus. They are starting to, although we certainly are aware of some that are still kind of on the old track, they are starting to say, boy, I'd rather be in a place where I can find those as part of the community fabric and to be able to be integrated into it. So as they start to find some of those assets that are already in the community, that starts to give a leg up on that particular location.
The actually, there's one other piece I want to add to this, and this piece that we don't often talk about in association with business, but you need to tap into the arts community, the arts and music community. Those have to be part of it. If you look around at a lot of the placemaking, where do people go? What do they do in the evenings? What do they do around their lives? But also, you know, is anybody familiar with the escape the room places, Vodaborg, things like that? Those kinds of uses are extraordinarily important. People want those places to go. They want those places to be active. The yoga studios, the climbing studios, you know, those active places. We have a lot of that out here in the suburbs. It also needs to be available in Watertown. There's an amazing climbing gym, and I'm watching things develop around it because it's an attraction. I'm watching transportation develop around a climbing gym. And people want those kinds of activities. Close to where they are, Brooklyn Boulders in Somerville put in a co-working space in the climbing gym. Right? Next door to Brooklyn Boulders is Artisans Asylum. 2 doors down is Greentown Labs. There's a reason they're all together. There's also a brewery right there in one stretch of Somerville.
That's a great point, and it's also a big challenge for the Beltway communities out here, the suburban communities, because truly 128 is still a office park environment where you drive your car, after you get out of traffic, you drive your car, you park, you walk across the parking lot into a building, and then you're stuck there until you have to leave and come out. So transforming that suburban office park into something more vibrant, I think, is a real challenge that needs to be addressed, not only locally through zoning and through comprehensive planning, but also at the state level in terms of what resources might be available to do that. Is that something MassDevelopment is thinking about? I'm thinking out here of just Burlington is a great example of the development going on there, where you have all of those things that you can walk from your office over to Kings and go bowling.
You do, although they face a lot of traffic, so there's always the trade-offs, right? One thing that we've been thinking a lot about is, in terms of this downtown piece, the concept of placemaking. So we actually are really interested in this idea of placemaking as really a catalyst for follow-on investment. So one example that actually was funded through another program that we run called Commonwealth Places is in Ashland. I don't know if you folks have heard of this. It's called the Corner Spot. Essentially, it's just a shed, really, that they constructed. The community all pitched in, they raised some funds, and we actually matched the funds that they raised. That's kind of how the program that we facilitate works. And they popped up this shed, created an outdoor community space, and in this shed, various companies are kind of trying out their business model. So every few weeks, somebody comes up. One time they had, I think, a barbecue place. They had something called a coffee trike that was in there. So there's something different. It's creating interest. It's bringing people into the downtown area. And it's also allowing these people to test out their concept. Is it something that might be viable? Should they carry it on to the next level? So that's just one example. We've also supported things like murals, getting into the sort of the artist space. There was a big project in the city of Lynn called Beyond Walls, where they actually painted murals on a lot of the building facades. And it actually made a huge difference. We did a evaluation study afterwards to see how much additional activity came in. And it actually showed that there was a ton more spending. So there's, it seems like, it's just a nice thing to do, but there are these economic development impacts that come out of placemaking that are linked to arts and culture. And those are things that you can focus on that in some cases can be lower lifts as well, that can actually make a big difference. So that's something we're interested in, and as I said, Commonwealth Places is the program. You guys should check it out. I think it's a really interesting resource. It brings together the community, like I said, to crowdfund, so we get that community support involved first, and then we will actually match that.
That's a really good point that you made, and actually you can reflect on some of that for the comprehensive plan. We're running into this and doing master plans in other communities, and Ashland's a great example of it, where they're called pop-up, either restaurants or pop-up retail that shows up for a few days in an empty storefront, for example. What's happened, though, is oftentimes that runs completely counter to either zoning or to code enforcement. Because the code officer says, oh, that has to be, you have to have handicap bathrooms and all this kind of stuff for a 2-day, event that's really going to bring people into your downtown. So it's something that needs to be thought of now as you're going into that. So
Along those lines, food trucks, which
yeah.
Local restaurants fight like crazy, and the truth is actually driving tremendous more business to local restaurants if they show up. And we tried to, we needed them and need them, and they would only allow them in certain spots. We've accepted it because we can't fight it too much. We're trying, but the inertia to kind of bring them into local communities, and then the thing that local communities don't seem to realize is they finally go, sure, come on in our communities, we'll accept you. And the food trucks go, yeah, that's great, but I need foot traffic, I'm going back downtown. So getting them to come to town, you need to beg. You think you have the power because you have the space. You don't. The power is actually in the food truck. You need to beg them and pay them money to show up. It will help the town more than it helps the food truck. But people think that it's going to help the food truck. Restaurants try to fight it because they think it's going to take away business. It doesn't. It's probably one of the #1 things you can do to drive activity in a very short amount of time. And it does mean you get into this issue of who's there and who's not. The people who are there will fight it. It actually will help them, and they just don't seem to realize it. So it's a funny piece. It's one, but like the zoning, like the other issues with pop-ups, it's one of those things that the benefit outweighs the challenge.
Okay, it's time to turn it around and let you ask the questions now of these distinguished panelists that we have here. Go ahead.
So, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but so it's my perception that right now the cool people and the cool companies want to be in the Seaport district, so in Boston, and I'm not saying that facetiously, but do those I work in technology, but right now I'm quite happy to be, and I live in Lexington, and I have a family, so somebody in my position probably likes being near Lexington, Burlington, Waltham. There's a lot of companies there, but I'm not one of those cool people. So my question is it a realistic expectation that you can, when you have some place like the Seaport District, that you can attract young single people who might want to end up living in your town when you're competing? I mean, no matter what you do, Lexington is never going to be the Seaport District.
I'll start because this is my day. There's two things going on. One is a PR issue, and I spoke to Catherine Carlock, who is the Boston Business Journal's commercial property reporter, and I asked her why she's not reporting on the suburbs, and there are actually two reasons. One is she's stationed downtown, and in order for her to come out to Waltham, as she said it, she needs to be able to report on multiple stories at once. As a PR person, that's a high bar. You now need to sell her on 3 or 4 different stories to get her out of her office. That's actually a challenge that exists within the journalism world, and that's one challenge. The second one is that the sheer size of deal that she reports on is so large downtown that it's hard to get her attention with smaller deals here. That said, we just heard from JLL, who went through and showed us all the stuff happening in the suburbs, the absorption rates, the deals that are happening here on a daily and weekly basis, and it's very strong. It's not going away. The big names like PTC moving downtown for that, those kinds of purposes belies the fact that companies are growing, right? And they are expanding. So the PR in some ways leans downtown. At the same time, there are huge issues with flooding downtown that they're starting to understand. There are huge issues with transportation that they're just starting to understand. Those are going to limit growth there to a certain degree. We're not out of it, right? In fact, what we need to figure out as 128 is where do we fit into that infrastructure.
So if I can add on to that, I agree with everything that Chuck just said, particularly that PR challenge and where the news is going. We have seen a lot of activity that really, when it's looking for much more this kind of a setting. But let me take a look at this from a pure site selection perspective and take a look at it again from the concept of talent writ large, not just the folks that you're talking about, cool, which we're not.
We're cool. We're cool.
My next album is coming out in a couple weeks. From a pure workforce perspective, taken into account of a lot of what we've been talking about from the transportation perspective, if you're in the middle of Boston, the hub of the universe, then that is the hub of the transportation system for this region. You are at the center of at least that workforce that is within 128. As you start to move out from that, you're limiting yourself to a spoke on that particular wheel, so a wedge on it. And for some users, that's going to be okay, and in fact desirable if they can understand who their target workforce is and if it exists within that. If they don't, then they may be viewing their options as being somewhat limited. But all that having been said, you look at the absorption rates and the vacancy rates in this part of the world, and they're still very favorable.
There's also an economic aspect of that too, in that they may be cool, but they're cool because someone's willing to pay them their salaries who's also paying $75 or $80 a square foot in rent for that space.
Yes.
And that's a very, very, very small slice of the business economy in Massachusetts. Most of the economy in Massachusetts is small businesses that are looking for not only affordable employees, but affordable space as well.
Yeah, I think that gets at what you were talking about earlier as well, in terms of identifying what your competitive strengths are, what industries you might want to target. I mean, just recently, Lexington actually saw like the first speculative development ever, I think, in the suburbs for bio. I think it's 115 Hartwell Ave. So that alone, the fact that somebody's willing to build a building without actually having a tenant yet, that speaks volumes to the amount of demand and what developers are anticipating, especially along Hartwell Ave. So
The biotech issue is huge. If you look at Kendall Square, it's so expensive to be in Kendall Square that the small biotechs have been priced out. And a lot of them, in fact, some of the branding for Watertown simply says, we're next door to Cambridge. But that's the idea. It works. We're cheaper and we're next door. To be near it, and the Route 2 corridor, this bike path connecting right down to Kendall Square is a huge asset. It's enormous.
Do you have questions? Yes, ma'am.
So we have been working in the town for the last 8 years on bringing a new visitor center project to Lexington Center. It's going to be taken up at town meeting this year. And for full disclosure, I'm chairman of the tourism committee, so I know this, but I would love each of you to comment on a question that's raised to us all the time, which is, well, the visitors are coming, a new building isn't going to affect that. And new exhibits and all the things that you've talked about aren't going to affect that. Can you help people understand what some of the benefits are in terms of driving traffic, how that affects foot traffic into the local businesses? Because our visitor center is just on the other side here, so it's right in the downtown. So anything you can share with that would be really helpful.
Oh, okay. It's not often the kind of stuff that we are working with from a corporate site location side of things. But putting my economic development hat on for a minute, I was the former chair of the Economic Development Commission in Newton, and my background too long ago was in land use planning. having a destination that people can go to naturally brings benefits to the things that surround it. That it's just a very simple rule of retail and of economic development. Having a place to go benefits everything around it. It actually goes even to the points of what Chuck was talking about before, where if you have a destination food truck, if you have a destination restaurant, it benefits everything that goes around it. So there's absolutely a case to be made for what you're saying. I am going to throw in one site selection side of this as well, which is as people are casually familiar with a place, they start to consider it for other things as well. So on top of the benefits that you're talking about with regards to local small business, it provides an opportunity for people who are just kind of casually familiar with Lexington also to say, oh, wait a minute, I'm familiar with that development. I digressed that as I was coming in. I understand they're also attracting bio. Maybe, when I get back to the office on Monday, I'll keep it in mind for that as well.
So,
Yes, sir.
My question is on the big opportunity that might be in Lexington. And to that extent, I'm asking about from Amanda. What do we know about Hanscom future of Hanscom? And how much we can expect that area to be available to Lexington?
well, I can't really comment on that. I actually do not know the answer to that question. But what I would say, kind of stepping back to what we've talked about previously and alluded to, I think you kind of know and have a sense of what some of your competitive advantages are. I just talked about the speculative development. You can really sort of seize on that bio piece. I think you guys already have the MassBio designation. Continue to sort of set up, anticipate trends like what Chris was referring to, things like cooling towers. Have that discussion, see if that's something that's amenable, something that you're interested in, and continue to build off of that cluster that you already have. I think there's great potential there. I can't speak specifically to any companies or developments, but I do feel like there's potential along Hartwell Ave and those different types of research as well.
Does everybody know what she's talking about with regards to the MassBio readiness ranking? MassBio is the organization that basically does outreach on behalf of the biotech industry in Massachusetts. And they have put together a ranking and basically a medal designation for how ready communities are to accept inward investment, new companies for biotech. And it goes just listed, bronze, silver, gold,
Platinum. Yeah.
platinum. And I was just trying to look up where Lexington is
I
on
think you're
that.
platinum. Does anybody know?
I thought they were
I'm pretty
I
sure.
think they're
you're-
platinum.
yeah.
Lexington is platinum.
So, that actually has advantages in two ways. One is, everything that we've been talking about before, you've done that kind of soul searching and identified that the biotech is something that you'd like to have part of your community. And you have identified land. It has been pre-entitled. You have a regulatory system that's ready for it to go. And it's basically, come here and we've got the place for you to go.
And their existing labs.
And their existing labs. The other is that MassBio is actually doing marketing on your behalf when they're going out globally and talking to biotech companies. So that's a very, very good fit.
Well, corresponding question is traffic on 128. I went to Hartwell, that food truck inauguration. I went and saw some people there. And a woman was there, young worker. I asked her, what do you like coming to Hartwell? I love it, and it's a great place, food truck is everything. The King Properties had done something there. So I asked, except one thing. When I finished my day's work, I got 1.5 hours to go back to South. Because traffic on 128 is just killer.
Yeah.
And if we guys are not going to do anything about it, nothing, all this talk doesn't go anywhere. Because we have a cut-through traffic through the town. Around traffic time, everybody is going through Lexington, Waltham Street. We have a cut-through traffic, Maple Street. How are you going to, every time we do something, we throw up a hand on traffic. But if there's a regional solution to traffic,
No. There isn't. But, the more that people are up in arms about it and we continue to talk about it, the biggest challenge with traffic is getting people's mindsets to shift away from cars and to people. And too often we say, oh, this needs to, it carries more traffic, make it wider, it'll carry more cars. And if you listen to anybody who knows transportation, they will talk more about people than about cars. A bus carries many more people than a car. bus-only lanes on the highways will make a difference. Try taking away a highway lane from the drivers and listen to the screaming, right? We need to counter that. And we need, if you want to solve the traffic problem, we can do it, but there needs to be some very hard decisions on the part of the communities to say, yes, we want to give up a lane on the highway, not widen it as 128 is continuing to be widened, but give that lane going from Newton Corner to Boston, there are buses that sit in traffic every day. I've ridden them, I've gotten sick on them for the number of times they've started stopping on around the Circle of Death in Newton. A bus-only lane that goes downtown will greatly change that. No one has the desire to put those pieces in place.
Now, that having been said, I just want to make sure that you guys know that this is not a unique issue to Eastern Massachusetts. There are regions all around the country, even internationally, but certainly all around the country that are dealing with a lot of these same issues and going into the same dialogue of how do we move people, how do we move workforce rather than how do we move cars. And you have seen some pretty interesting, in some cases, some very costly measures like trying to create rights of way for either buses or for light rail where the land doesn't exist, so elevating lines and things of that nature. So it's a common dialogue. You know, the bad news is that everybody's trying to solve the problem. The good news is that everybody's trying to solve the problem, and there are other examples that are out there that we might want to borrow some solutions from.
I think there's also a broader context as well. So there's the whole land use piece of things, there's the housing piece of things,
Yes.
which was alluded to as well. You know, if there were more affordable options throughout the state, that people could maybe afford to live a little closer to work, a very difficult problem to solve. But those are sort of the contextual issues that we're within, and hopefully you guys will be talking about some of that stuff through the master planning process, because all of that, of course, informs the reason why the highways are so congested, and thinking, you know, holistically about that in future development, where development goes, is a big piece of trying to solve some.
So make sure too you come and bring those questions up to the next transportation session like this, because that does set the context for it. We're going to wrap up here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but you know, this is a question I've been looking at for years and years and years. Is there's very little empirical evidence anywhere in the world that more traffic, more congestion leads to lower or stable pricing of real estate. And you see that around here, you see it in New York, you see it in other cities that are doing, you see it in Hong Kong. People want to be in these places and they're willing to put up with that inconvenience of traffic, and that still drives up real estate values.
That's
pretty much
absolutely
where you
true.
are.
I mean, traffic is an indicator that there's something that
Yeah.
people want to be near. The challenge very often for communities like ours around here is are we on the way between two destinations, or are in fact we one of the destinations? And the work that we can do through some of these discussions with regards to housing and economic development is making sure that we have the places that are in fact some of the endpoints of that activity so that we're getting the benefit.
That's why you're lucky here, because you are in the middle of a destination, and you
Yeah.
live in Lexington, you can go to work pretty easily. You might have a couple of traffic lights. You don't necessarily have to get to Providence or to Portsmouth or wherever it might be. So
JF likes to joke that Detroit solved the traffic problem.
that's what you did. Exactly. Good point. How are we doing time-wise? Any more time for another question?
Okay, we've got a little bit more time.
Can we just hear Chuck repeat what he just said about what solves the traffic problem? Backroad in here.
Oh, sorry, Detroit solved its traffic problem.
Yeah. That's ironic.
Good point. Good point. So let me get one in the back in there. So we go. Yes, sir.
I'd like to change the focus slightly. What we're trying to do at the moment, essentially, is to create a strategic plan for the future. And so the question is, what are we, and what do we want to be, and how do we get there? And so, in various aspects, transportation is one, commercial is one. This is a community that has a big historic state. We have a cultural background. We're very well developed in most of what we want. We have the education in place. We have cultural in place. We're culturally rich. We have an intellectually rich population. But what will the future be? You're talking transportation. Nobody's talking about what happens when nobody's driving their car. Do we need more parking or less parking? What happens when various other aspects of the future, which we can predict in broad terms, unfold? So in your experience that you're working with various things, how much are you looking at what is evolving in the future and how that impacts us? Because part of it is understanding what's going to happen and how we manage it, not how we create it.
Thank you, that's a very good point. And from an economic development perspective, let me cede that to the panelists. There is a tremendous movement afoot of people working from where they live or where they happen to be at the moment, as opposed to going to a place and doing that work there. I see it in my work, my staff work from home 2 or 3 days a week, I do it myself. How is that influencing what is going to happen in a community like Lexington or in the 128 Beltway region?
So let me just kind of weigh in on that briefly. First of all, from the corporate site location side of things, we've seen some interesting changes in that folks that are looking to establish maybe 100, 500 person facility, particularly if it's office-based work, they will also look in a place where there's a network of not co-working spaces, as Chuck's talking about, but shared working spaces, where there are still almost a Regis Plus kind of a situation, where there are offices that can be taken and the door closed, so it's whatever, but it's flexible. It acts much more on a membership type basis, and there are support services that are there so that people can work closer to home for some period of the time. And that's actually a trend that's been around for probably about 15 years, but it's accelerating. So for example, our offices are downtown in Boston, but we have in the floors that are around us are a lot of corporate users that otherwise would have taken larger space, but they want to just have a satellite here that they don't want to maintain their own office space. So that's something that I think we need to pay attention to. With the autonomous vehicle side, I know that Chuck's done a lot of thinking on this.
Autonomous vehicles have the potential to be the greatest thing to happen in society and the worst thing that can happen in society at the same time. If you listen to Chris Dempsey of Transportation for Mass, he'll talk about the second rush hour. If all of us go out and buy an autonomous vehicle and we have it drive ourselves downtown, you don't want to pay for parking, it's going to drive itself back. That's a second rush hour, right? All of a sudden all the cars are going back and forth again. That's just if we own them. If we don't own them and they're moving through the streets, now you have an isolation problem. You're getting into a vehicle with nobody else. You're going with nobody else. You're getting out of your destination and you're not speaking to anybody. You're isolating yourself from location. Then there's challenges that, if you look at what Toyota is talking about with these boxes on wheels, where your retail now comes to your house as opposed to you going to a downtown, where you go on Amazon and you say, I'd like to try on these 30 different shoes. They're loaded into a car and they show up at your doorstep with a person who steps out and says, come on in, try on your shoes. And then you walk out your driveway, you try them on and you go somewhere else. These are problems that we haven't even begun to think about. That's the AV side of things. And you're correct to say, what do we do, what goes on with parking? Then there's the issue of what happens to revenue. I paid for my parking. The parking revenue disappears. If you no longer own the vehicle, the excise tax disappears. If the vehicles are electric and they're driving around town, the gas tax disappears. How do we manage all of that? What happens to the revenue of town? These are huge, huge problems that go well beyond economic development and go into quality of life and what our cities globally look like. Coming back to something that Chris was talking about in terms of where people are working, there's some very interesting technology that is starting to emerge, and buildings are being very slow in adopting it around things like sensors in property to understand what offices are being utilized and which are not, increasing utilization rates of these locations. The other thing is, I worked in an office in Newton where I worked with a guy, an old school guy, came out of Somerville and said, you put your nose in the ground. I said, you come in the office, you sit there for 8 hours a day. That's very different than dealing with a millennial who says, I want an attractive place to go, otherwise why would I bother showing up? So that idea that you have to create something people want to be in, not just give them a box to sit in, and then look at how it's being utilized. These are pieces people think about every day. How do you create an environment that's inviting as part of that shared office challenge?
And friendly as well.
Yeah.
You know, I've noticed when I walk over to Panera, I've had 4 people walking down the street said good morning to me. I work in a lot of communities, and that's rare. And I think that's something too that you as residents need to reflect upon. It's that vibe you give off. Are you welcoming? Are you inviting? Are you just a friendly place to be? So if this is my first time here and I'm here for some reason and I have the potential of either starting a business or bringing a business here, first impressions really count. Any other things? Or are we, we're over our time now? Are we good or?
We're at 9:45.
Okay. We're going to go for an hour, so we're about that now. Could we have time for, you had your hand up, so let's go for another question here.
Great, thanks. In comparing Lexington to our neighboring towns here in 128, it seems to me that we have less density both on the residential side and on the commercial side. And I'm just wondering, first of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, if so, given our proximity to Boston, major city, is that unusual that we have such low density this close to the major city?
I think it comes back to sort of this local control piece that we're talking about. So obviously all of this, well, not all of it, some of it predates zoning, but a lot of it is managed now by zoning. So, you know, if you have certain density regs in your zoning right now, obviously that's controlling what you're seeing. I would say there are other communities that are close in, you know, that do have a similar level of density, some that are much more dense, like Waltham, for example. I don't think it's necessarily something I would characterize as rare, but again, you know, if your zoning doesn't allow for it, then it's, you know, it's not going to happen. And that's a community conversation to have is what are the values, you know, what do you want to see going forward, and maybe that's something you want to discuss as part of the planning process.
And a point to, you know, really to reinforce what's been set up here on that thing. If you're going to be attractive, particularly to a younger workforce, there's an economic side of that. You're also an expensive community. You have large single-family homes that are out of reach for most young people, young families that are starting. What you do from a zoning and planning perspective to deal with that is going to be absolutely critically important in the upcoming years. Whether it's accessory apartments, whether it's the ability to change and allow higher density, more housing units within a given acreage of land or within a given area, that's something you're going to have to really deal with, because it's got not only that housing side and the transportation side, the social side, but also it's going to be critically important in providing the economic development foundation for growth in the future.
Well, Needham is actually an interesting case in this, because Needham if you speak to people from Needham, they'll say, we're far more suburban than Newton. You know, they kind of separate themselves from that. And Needham has this interesting spot in the area that I'm dealing with, which is effectively between two rivers, between the Charles River and the 128. And there's this interesting carve out that was actually the land that became the Back Bay. That's the land that was cut down to become the gravel that filled in the Back Bay. And that's the N Squared Innovation District. Needham took that as an opportunity to rezone and to increase the density on that side. It's separate away from the rest of the village and the rest of the town. In saying that can be more dense. That was fine. Now that they're trying to talk about Gould Street, which is on the other side of 128, now bordering with residential properties, and talking about increasing the density there, the fight is getting more intense. And the neighbors are starting to show up and saying, we don't want this density that's close to us. They really do need it. There is an affordability problem. Newton has an affordability problem. We're running into the same challenges on areas that should be dense along Washington Street and Newton, where you'll hear arguments of, we don't want the buildings to be more than 3 stories tall or 4 stories tall. It's kind of missing the point, because it's what kind of people do we want to bring in and allow into our community, which is a horrible way to look at it, but that's ultimately what it is. Yeah. And it's saying we want to build a housing that attracts, you know, folks of various backgrounds and various socioeconomic backgrounds and ages and so on. You can't get, I mean, I live in a small house in Newton and I couldn't afford it today. I bought it 20 years ago. There's no way I could buy the house now. And it's tiny. To not have that option for somebody else is to me, it's a huge challenge.
So just kind of a data point on that, I just looked it up here. Median home price in Lexington right now is $958,000.
Which is lower than Newton, by the way, 1.1 in Newton.
Yeah.
And $1 million in Newton.
But you start to compare that, for example, to Natick. Natick is, I think, 400,000. Is it 400,000 or 500,000? So, when we start talking about housing and then the ability to move between that housing and the places where there are economic opportunity, that's our traffic problem right there.
Yep. It's amazing how this is all interrelated. And that's what the comp plan does. Hopefully, brings it all together. Well, thank you all for coming, and appreciate it. Thank our panelists, please.